Well, the government is moving to tighten consumer protections across superannuation and financial services while promising to preserve choice and access to advice. To get across those reform details, we're joined by Blake Briggs from the Financial Services Council. Blake, welcome back to you.
Thank you.
So, look, this has been perhaps a long time coming, but nonetheless, clearly in response to those disasters such as the collapse of Shield and First Guardian.
Yeah, so look, the Shield and First Guardian collapses were significant, and I think about 12,000 consumers were adversely impacted. To the government's credit, though, it worked through what changes were necessary in a methodical way and released yesterday quite a comprehensive set of reforms that really went to the heart of the harm that was caused in the different parts of the value chain. And to its credit, it actually pushed back on some of the arguments that were being made that I think had a bit of commercial self-interest. And the main one there is, restricting a consumer's capacity to choose their own super fund under the guise of protecting them from bad choice, but really taking away that agency from the average consumer. So it did thread the needle, and I think at the end of the day landed on the right policy outcome, which was consumers should be able to have control of their own superannuation.
Okay, bottom line though, so they've got that obligation from those super trustees to compensate consumers should they face those financial losses.
Yeah, so this one is critical, and it actually goes to the heart of what happened. So if you look at the consumer harm that was caused, if the due diligence processes of the trustee when they were selecting that investment option for their menu contributed to the failure, then they have an obligation to make consumers whole. Now, it is really important. The sector isn't here underwriting people's investment losses. They're not underwriting the advice process. It really goes to their own legal obligations to do effective due diligence on an investment option, and they need access to capital so that if that process fails, they can make consumers whole. But as soon as you know that there is that backstop in the system, that trustees take responsibilities for the products that they make available, then a lot of the need around, okay, we're going to stop consumers from being able to make choice in that, the need for that falls away because consumers have this backstop at the end of the day.
What of that move to bring advice in-house for super funds?
Yeah, and so that was quite a significant shift, and probably one that was a bit of a surprise to a lot of the audience. There has been a strong push to change advice regulation to make advice more accessible, and that had kind of stalled because, to be fair, the government had to deal with the Shield and First Guardian issue first. But what they've now done is they've said, okay, we know we've got a comprehensive package on the Shield and First Guardian, so we're also going to progress some of the advice reforms. They're going to allow superannuation funds and life insurers the capacity to employ lower skilled types of advisors to help with very simple questions. Importantly, they're not going to allow them to make product recommendations to avoid that issue of vertical integration coming back into the system.
How do they avoid that though? Because they're potentially, it's a fine line, a conflict of interest, isn't it?
It is, and we haven't yet seen the drafting of the legislation. So this will be a really important one to design, and to be fair, very important to the advice community who see that the professional service they provide as being something that can't be watered down. So we've got to recognise that. But what they're going to do is they're trying to distinguish what is information from what is actual genuine advice. Information is things like when you call up your fund and you've got simple questions about the options that are available to you, they can answer those questions without it being considered personal advice. But if you call up and say, I'm approaching retirement, I've got an investment property, I've got this much in my super, my spouse has that much, what should I do? They can't give you recommendations on that. They need to steer you towards a personal advisor. And so I think that is an important distinction, and it's one that legislation is going to have to get right.
Also, the legislation for the requirement that trustees set and enforce advice fee deduction caps. How significant is that?
Well, so this was an existing obligation on a lot of trustees, but it was a grey area. There was an expectation from the regulators that superannuation funds would have levels over which or under which a consumer can't be charged advice fees because their balance isn't big enough, or the advice could not be comprehensive enough to justify a fee of that size. And ASIC did a recent report where they found compliance with that was patchy across different organisations. So the minister has gone, actually, no, to be clear, this obligation will be a hard-coded obligation into law, and every superannuation fund will expect to have advice fee caps built into their governance processes.
Also looking to close loopholes in the anti-hawking regime. So this is all about sort of those predatory practices. I mean, how common is that?
Yeah, this was a big one. This was the big driver of Shield and First Guardian. There were fraudulent products in the market. We shouldn't forget that. But their capacity to reach scale and harm as many consumers as they did was fueled by lead generation. So you had organisations out there, harvesting consumers' details, getting the clients warm, handing them off onto, what are called advisors, but were clearly not actually providing proper financial advice, and then tipping those consumers into those products, which proved to be fraudulent when they collapsed. Lead generators were a crucial link in that. So these reforms are actually a critical component to make sure that consumer harm could never happen at that scale again.
Blake, the compensation scheme of last resort has been a backstop for those that have lost money. But as the government recognises, it has become unsustainable given those payouts, and the question of who pays for this.
Yeah, and unsustainable is the right word. We had a situation where this year the scheme is hitting $200 million, and of course the organisations that did the wrong thing aren't contributing to the scheme. It's actually all the organisations who are compliant and running good businesses that have to pay for it. And so it's inherently unfair, and it inherently creates a lot of principal agent issues in the system. But what we're looking at is sensible reforms to put it back on a sustainable path so that it can still be there in the long term. If it got to a point where the cost was going to blow out year on year and get larger and larger, it would lose its, what's the right word? Its public right to exist, for want of a better term. And so in order to make sure that it continues to have the support of consumer groups and the industry and the willingness to fund it, it needs to be put on a sustainable footing. And the Minister announced a range of reforms and also new funding parties to it, like SMSFs, in order to put it on that sustainable footing.
Now, Blake, of course, we've seen investors seeking more and more advice, perhaps dubiously, particularly online, dare I say, AI is featuring now too. How critical is it that the number of advisors who are qualified and well educated increases?
Yeah, and look, the average consumer thinks of advice as wherever they get it from. I mean, we are worried about the prevalence of AI providing personal product advice, because if you go into ChatGPT and you ask it where should you invest your super and name a specific fund, it gives you a specific fund.
Yeah.
And it could base that on information sources that are completely incorrect. And so we're worried about the treatment of sources of advice from all different areas as equivalent. The reality is we want people getting advice from a trusted, reliable source. Now, getting the number of financial advisors up is critical to that, but the reality is with only 15,000 advisors in the market and about 4 million Australians that would have enough to benefit from personal advice, we're not going to get enough advisors in the near term. That's why the government's move to open up forms of advice and information to superannuation funds and life insurers is important, because they actually have the resources to train up the next generation of advisors. And it will introduce consumers to the idea of picking up the phone to someone and asking for a bit of a help and assistance. And they might go, actually, that was really useful. And in a couple of years' time, when they've got a bit more, they pick up the phone to a personal advisor and they go, okay, I've got enough now to get a full financial plan. And it introduces them to that continuum of quality advice and protects them from unreliable sources.